Towards the early stages of World War II, the United States had decided that they would remain neutral within foreign affairs. The Neutrality Acts were passed during the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt in September of 1939. Shortly after, as an opportunity to gain more money approached, the cash and carry provision was passed, allowing the selling of weapons and materials to those fighting in the war, under the condition that those buying the materials would have to ship them back on their own ships. The Selective Training and Service Act drafted people into the military, building up our army. The Lend-Lease Act was passed after, lending weapons to countries vital to our defense. President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill signed the Atlantic Charter, making it very clear as to what the World War was being fought for, even before the United States had officially entered the conflict. The German U-boat attacks in September of 1941 increased the United States' involvement in the war, as a German U-boat fired 2 torpedoes at the U.S. destroyer called the Greer, and it also sank the U.S. destroyer the Reuben James, killing 100 sailors. After Japan began taking over French military bases in Indochina, the United States cut off trade with them, protesting their aggression. On December 7, 1941, a day which President Roosevelt declared as a date which will live in infamy, the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, which was the largest U.S. naval base in the Pacific. Thus, the United States declared war on Japan, and 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Now we're fully involved in World War II. World War II highly affected life on the home front, to those living back at home, not physically fighting in the war. The industrial world had a huge response to the war, as factories began to produce pieces essential to the war. Factories which used to make mechanical pencils began to make bomb parts, and soda companies converted filling bottles with liquid to filling shells with explosive devices. This time period also changed many women's lives, as more than 6 million women began to labor in war industries. While many men were away at war, women proved that they could do the same jobs as men, and thus women were given incredible new opportunities in the workforce. Also, more than 2 million minority workers were hired. Due to inequality in the workforce against minorities, President Roosevelt eventually issued an order to allow all workers, no matter what race, to have equal participation in the defense industries. Groups such as the Navajo Code Talkers and the Tuskegee Airmen turned out to terrifically help our efforts in the war. The publishing and radio industries boomed during this time, as magazines and radio shows covered the latest war reports. The economy was also affected, as prices on goods were frozen by the Office of Price Administration, while rationing or the creation of fixed portions of goods were put into place. Advances in science were created, with Roosevelt creating the Office of Scientific Research and Development, which encouraged the use of pesticides like DDT to fight insects, and also encouraged the development of penicillin, known as the miracle drug, to heal the pain of soldiers. Of course, a huge scientific development on the home front of the war was the creation of the atomic bomb program, which came to be known as the Manhattan Project, which was the determining factor that eventually ended our involvement in World War II, making us victorious. In many aspects of people's lives in the 1950s, conformity was very prevalent. A huge strategy for business expansion, franchising, developed during this time. A franchise is a company that offers similar products or services in many different locations. Franchises such as McDonald's were really important pieces of conformity in the 50s, as they standardized what people ate, and with many of these restaurants growing from town to town, people were flocking to the same restaurants. In the corporate world, people were expected to conform to the ideal company person. Companies would give personality tests, actually, to potential employees to make sure they would fit in the corporate culture, and therefore those applying for the job would have to really fit a mold or pretend to be somebody they weren't and conform just so they could get the job. The suburbs and the creation of tract homes was a key factor to conformity. With the baby boom, or the population explosion due mainly to soldiers coming home from World War II, families grew larger, and as a result, more were moving to the suburbs. Due to the families growing in size, the roles of women became less important in the workforce. The typical role of the man of the house was for him to work and provide for the family, while the role of the woman was to cook, clean, and take care of the children at home. The suburban lifestyle created a huge issue for conformity, as it was looked down upon if a woman were to work. Women could not really be different in work, but instead had to conform. The youthful generation also displayed conformity, as they listened to the same rock and roll music by artists such as Elvis Presley, and often dressed the same as the other, following the same trends. Leisure items in the 50s were an avid part of conformity, as all of the residents of a typical suburban neighborhood felt they had to own what their neighbor had, and in a way, it was their way of trying to fit in and be the same as everyone else. More people during this time than ever owned washing machines, clothes dryers, vacuums, and the television became a staple item that most households, if not every household, owned. The roots of the Cold War were essentially the differences between the United States and the Soviet Union. First, the Soviet Union believed in a communist society where the state controlled all property and economic activity, while the United States believed in the capitalistic American system where citizens are able to control their own property and economic activity. In the democratic system of America, people elect a president and a Congress from two opposing sides of political parties. However, on the contrary, the Soviet Union established a totalitarian government where no opposing parties are allowed to even exist. After Stalin learned that the United States was hiding their development of the atomic bomb from them, relations worsened. At the Yalta and Potsdam conferences discussing Germany and Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union wanted to keep Germany weak and divided while completely taking over Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, they wanted to create a buffer zone of satellite nations who would too be communist, supporting the Soviet Union. The United States, on the other hand, wanted to stabilize and rebuild Germany and have raw markets for trading in Eastern Europe to benefit the United States, as well as setting up free elections in Eastern Europe too. Overall, the Soviet Union wanted to spread communism, keep Germany weak, and create a buffer zone in Eastern Europe, while the United States wanted to contain or stop the spread of communism, spread democracy instead, stabilize Germany, and help war-weary nations to rebuild. These drastic differences were overall the roots of the Cold War. The Cold War highly affected Americans at home, as one of the biggest effects came to be that people feared communist influence, much like the Red Scare in the 1920s. Due to paranoia that more people were growing more loyal of the Soviet Union than the United States, President Truman created the Federal Employees Loyalty and Security Program, which then formed the Loyalty Review Board, and these programs investigated 3.2 million employees, firing those found to be disloyal to America. The House Committee of Un-American Activities investigated members of the movie industry after several pro-Soviet films were released. 10 Hollywood film members accused of being communists, known as the Hollywood 10, decided not to cooperate with the committees as they felt their rights were being violated. As a result, they were sent to prison. Speculation and fear of communism driven by the Cold War also caused the birth of a blacklist, which was created by Hollywood executives and was a list that condemned those who they thought had a communist background. A person who was blacklisted had their careers ruined. Spy cases added an epidemic of fear to the people in America. Alger Hiss was a former State Department official who was accused of spying for the Soviet Union, and while he claimed his innocence, he was charged with perjury and was sent to jail. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, minor activists in the American Communist Party, were accused of giving the Soviet Union information about America's atomic bomb. After denying the charges, they were found guilty and given the death penalty by the electric chair. The theory arising due to the Cold War was the idea known as McCarthyism, created by anti-communist activist Senator Joseph McCarthy. He was known to accuse people of being disloyal to America without providing evidence, and because of McCarthy, some people felt that it was okay to just accuse those who didn't even have evidence on of being communists, and in many cases innocent people were accused. The Cold War created many tensions, worries, and fear among the American people. No, I do not believe that the United States' involvement in Vietnam was appropriate or effective, because this issue did not directly affect us, we came out of the war defeated, and tens of thousands of American lives were lost that didn't need to be. After the Geneva Conference, where Vietnam was split into the Communist North Vietnam and the anti-Communist South Vietnam, the U.S. supported South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem. Conflict was not directly changing or affecting our lives, which is why I feel this initial support for Diem was inappropriate. The United States feared the domino theory, which was the theory that if Vietnam became communist, then all of the countries around it would fall to communism as well. President Diem in South Vietnam canceled free elections and outlawed Buddhism, to which Buddhist monks were burning themselves alive in protest. Eventually, the U.S.-supported military coup crushed Diem's regime. This clearly just shows how our involvement was not effective whatsoever, as we had to take out the leader that we supported in the first place. In 1964, an American destroyer was fired at off of the North Vietnamese coast. There was bad weather, and it was not for certain if this attack had been by North Vietnam. However, Congress passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, where Johnson could take all of the necessary means to repel any forces against the U.S. And we now had 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam based on an attack that we weren't even certain was from the North Viet Cong. In response to the ambush hit-and-run tactics, the United States dropped napalm and Agent Orange to destroy the jungles of Vietnam. Even these methods were ineffective, as the incident called the Tet Offensive occurred, where Viet Cong surprisingly attacked in 100 towns and 12 U.S. military bases until we finally realized we could not win this war. After North Vietnam won the war, America had to face 58,000 killed Americans. These were thousands of lives gone that did not need to be. After the war, the domino theory turned out to be true, as all of the countries around Vietnam had become communist as well. Therefore, what we were originally fighting for in the war to prevent ended up happening, showing once again that our involvement was inappropriate and ineffective. The civil rights movement was a movement certainly with its successes and failures. Successes included the results of the Brown versus Board of Education case, which ruled that the idea of separate but equal had no place in the field of education, desegregating schools. The Little Rock crisis in Arkansas, was a success and a failure, as 9 black students were successfully integrated into an all-white school, but unsuccessfully they were faced with an abusive and hateful crowd along the way. After Rosa Parks refused to move from sitting in a whites-only section on a Montgomery bus and was arrested in return, Pastor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led boycotts on Montgomery buses for 381 days until the Supreme Court outlawed bus segregation. After the successful Million Man March in D.C., where Dr. King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, the monumental Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, prohibiting the discrimination of someone because of race, religion, or gender. Sit-ins, where African Americans would sit in segregated areas waiting to be served, were unsuccessful mostly as they were faced with tear gas, water hoses, and intense violence. Violence continued when freedom riders who tested to see if cities were enforcing the desegregation of buses were brutally beaten, attacked, and even firebombed. As a result, however, segregation was banned on all travel and public facilities. During the Selma campaign during the Freedom Summer, groups peacefully protested literacy tests and poll taxes, keeping black people from voting. Immense violence broke out. Martin Luther King Jr. responded with a 50-mile march to the state capital, Montgomery. Successfully, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, eliminating the literacy tests and poll taxes. However, during this time, violent groups led by leaders such as Malcolm X were formed, like the Black Panthers who supported Black Power, and often within these groups, violent urban riots unfortunately broke out. The civil rights movement certainly had its improvements, but it was also faced with violence and hatred, which made some aspects unsuccessful. Generally, the social groups of the 60s wanted to spread their own messages and opinions and push for more rights and actions to take place about their specific causes. Hispanic Americans were receiving very little pay for their difficult labor and wanted greater representation. Leaders such as Cesar Chavez created the National Farm Workers Association and the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, as well as the political movement that was formed, La Raza Unida. Native Americans were among the poorest in America and were quite unhappy after the termination policy of 1953 relocated many of them away from their reservations. For more power to choose how they wanted to live, the Declaration of Indian Purpose was formed, as well as the American Indian Movement, and the Trail of Broken Treaties March protested treaties that had been broken by the government. During the social movement, women vied for political, economic, and social equality with men. As a result of their movement, feminist Betty Friedan created the National Organization for Women, the National Women's Political Caucus was formed, giving women more political opportunities, and the Roe v. Wade case granted women the right to an abortion 3 months into their pregnancy. Gays and lesbians hoped to gain political visibility as well, and have an outlaw of discrimination against homosexuals. As a result of their goals and movement, 7 states and 110 communities outlawed discrimination against gays. A new group called the New Left was created, made up by the Students for a Democratic Society and the Free Speech Movement. Their goals were to restore participatory democracy and have greater individual freedom, including more freedom in speech, and many formed with the counterculture movement. The counterculture or hippie movement had main goals to protest against the typical American society. They wanted to spread peace and love while protesting the Vietnam War. LSD, or acid, led to their downfall, destroying their movement and creating a stir of violence as well. Environmentalists wanted to protect the environment, create standards for air and water pollution, and bring awareness about the earth. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring brought awareness to pesticides. The Earth Awareness Day, Earth Day, was created, as well as the Environmental Protection Agency. The Clean Air and Water Act was passed as well to improve and control water and air pollution.